Hi, we are members of the AVID team as well as members of the English department, and we wanted to show you a few skills to kind of help with your students with reading to learn, since that's been our focus for the last couple weeks. So these are a few things that we do in both our English 1 and our English 2 on-level courses in order to annotate text.
Hi. So first of all, we need to know that annotation is a process used to converse with the text. Everyone is going to annotate a little bit differently, but by giving the students some guidelines, it helps them to engage in the text in a way that makes sense to them. One thing we have been finding is, especially with lower level students, if we over-annotate, it can make the text more confusing and more difficult to understand. And so the steps we've given them kind of back it off a little bit, gives them tools that allows them to engage without feeling overwhelmed. It's important that they understand that annotation is about their interaction with the text and not about guessing what we think is important as the teacher.
So the article that we're using today, we actually got from AVID Weekly. This is a source that you're able to use because we are an AVID demonstration school. So they have plenty of really good articles that we can get for free, which is always nice. And if you need help on figuring out how to access that, just ask someone that is on the AVID site team and they can help you figure that out. So if you look at our annotation steps, we have what we call, the process that we use is #cuss. The kids tend to like this acronym because we usually tell them that we're going to cuss the text, and for some reason that they think it's hilarious that we're going to be cussing in class. The first step is going to be the number the paragraphs, okay? So if you go ahead and look, we've already numbered the paragraphs on this document. There's a couple reasons behind that. The first one is so that if we're referencing a certain section of the text, a student can say, well, in paragraph 15, the author makes this point. And so, or if, especially on standardized testing, they will ask specific questions about a certain paragraph. So it's helpful for the students to know which paragraph they're exactly talking about. A couple things to keep in mind is if you look at paragraph 6, it's really short. So you need to kind of make sure that your students understand that even those short paragraphs count as paragraphs, as well as if you look at paragraph 11, it actually kind of goes on to the next page. So those aren't two separate paragraphs. They are going to be one and the same.
The next step is circle new or important words. So my kids like to circle words and then not define them, which defeats the purpose. And I tell them that the definition can be done in just 1 or 2 words. We see an example with this in the very first paragraph. Some students might not know what the word ambition means. And so they would circle it and just draw a little arrow to the side and say it's a goal or a hope. And that would be enough to kind of work with in the future as they're going through. Other examples of this, though, we can see here in paragraph 7 at the top of the page, where they've underlined something important, worthless, unless it represents substantial personal commitment. But the word it needs to be specified, so they might circle it and say the degree specifically. We see this just throughout. There's a lot of words here that are just important overall. Again, things like proficiency and perspective, they would need to define in some way, but it can be a short, simple definition.
Okay. The next step is going to be to underline important details. Okay, this is a step that kids really have problems with because they're like, okay, what does important mean? And then underline every word in the entire text. So if you look, a lot of times the way that I like to do it is I like to kind of circle a section. If you look in paragraph 8, where we have education is circled, that's one of our main thoughts, then you're going to underline things that apply to that main idea or that unfamiliar word. Because sometimes this kind of pushes the idea that sometimes you can find the definitions of words in the context of the article. So that kind of helps them figure out what some of those words they don't know mean. And it helps them understand why that word maybe is kind of important to the article overall.
And then, of course, star the main idea. This particular passage, the main idea was at the end of the article, and sometimes that throws kids off because they've been told that it'll be at the very beginning, but that's not always true, and so they have to read through the whole thing. When they get to that main idea, they need to put a star off to the side to show that they recognize it, and then really spend some time with that section, showing that they understand what the main idea is.
So the last step is to summarize the text as a whole. So sometimes I have my students, if a text is broken up into sections, sometimes especially in other content areas, there's going to be different sections that are kind of unrelated. So you might have to have your students summarize in sections. But in order to not make it too difficult or inaccessible, like we talked about, sometimes if you annotate too much, it can be more confusing. So we just summarized towards the bottom of the text. Okay, so we went ahead and had a summary. It's just a one-sentence summary, not anything really complicated or difficult or anything like that. It's just so that we can kind of make sure that we know what the main idea is. For the most part, if your student can't summarize in 1 or 2 sentences, then they really haven't figured out what's actually important in the article. A lot of times we actually like to do pretty short summaries. Sometimes I even limit my students to 17 words just because it's a random number, but
it makes them narrow it down to the main purpose.
Exactly. Okay.
I'll add to that too that summaries are great, those short ones at the end, because if you're working with multiple texts at one time, if they have a quick summary at the end, that they can do quick references to which one they need to look at. And then the big questions is another tool that we use and some of the upper grade levels use. These are just short symbols that you've probably seen throughout. Things like what surprised me. Sometimes they may comment on it, but it's just putting an exclamation mark next to information that they may have found surprising. And the information doesn't have to necessarily relate directly to the main idea, but it can help them not get sidetracked too completely if they just, oh, that's shocking, and then move on. But sometimes it also helps them to identify that important information as well. So like my students would get really distracted by this idea that gangsters make more money than anybody else. So if they can just put an exclamation mark, move on, that can help. And then perhaps most useful is the question mark, what confused me, and then what challenged, changed, and confirmed what I knew with a check mark. We see a great example of this together with paragraphs 9 and 10. There's an odd metaphor here where she seems to just randomly start talking about her childhood friend being a picky eater. And so it can be confusing. So they might put a question mark and a question like, why are they talking about food? In the next paragraph, however, she goes on and explains the metaphor more fully. So the student would want to put a check mark and then identify what the actual problem was, why they were confused. It was a metaphor.
So for time purposes and that sort of thing, because we know that you're professional educators, we did not step-by-step do this with you. We just showed it once we'd finished. For the purpose of doing it with your students, I would suggest the first time that you teach this, you probably should kind of step-by-step show them and do like a think aloud where you're showing them why you're doing this or why you're doing certain things, even if it's something similar to what we just did. Also, if you use online, obviously we've done this online, so there are ways to do online annotation in order to use those online resources. There's also, if you need to save paper or something like that, you can always convert this to be, maybe you could have them annotate on notebook paper while they have the class set of an article by their desk, or especially if it's a textbook or something like that, it's not really realistic for them to be able to mark into the text.
Right. If they use Google tools, they could always, bold instead of circle or highlight instead of underline, which makes it a clean, easy way to do that digitally. I think that's everything. So thank you so much for your time. Please feel free to reach out to the AVID site team if you have questions, comments, or concerns.